The Alpha King ruled with teeth and fear. The Omega taught him how to love. The kingdom of Thornhaven had not known peace in 17 years. Not since the day young Ragnar Ingja took the throne with blood on his hands and fury in his heart. The coronation had been a massacre, disguised as ceremony. 12 nobles, who opposed his claim, found dead in their chambers, their throats torn open by what the official records called wild animals. Though everyone knew the truth, the new king ran with wolves. He spoke their language. Some whispered he was more wolf than man, that his mother had lain with a demon in the deep forest, that the beast's blood ran so thick in his veins that moonlight made him dangerous. The truth was somehow both simpler and more terrible. Ragnar had been abandoned as an infant in the Blackwood Forest, left to die by a mother whose face he would never know. The wolf pack that found him should have killed him, should have torn the crying human whelp apart and scattered his bones among the leaves. Instead, the alpha female, an ancient she-wolf with silver fur and scars that mapped a lifetime of survival, had carried him to her den and nursed him alongside her own cubs. For 5 years, Ragnar lived as a wolf, learned as a wolf, thought as a wolf. He learned that the world was divided into 2 categories, predator and prey. He learned that mercy was weakness. He learned that the pack survived because the strong dominated and the weak submitted. When hunters found him at age 5, a feral child who snarled and bit and fought with teeth and nails, they brought him to the royal court as a curiosity. King Aldous the Gentle, who had no sons of his own, saw something in the wild boy's amber eyes, something fierce and unbreakable that his own soft courtiers lacked. Against all advice, against all reason, the king claimed Ragnar as his own, gave him a name, gave him a throne to inherit, tried to give him humanity. But you cannot civilize a wolf by putting a crown on its head. You can only teach it to wear the crown while the wolf remains beneath. Aldous was murdered in his sleep when Ragnar was 23 years old, poisoned by nobles who believed the throne should pass to a true-born heir, not some forest foundling with questionable blood. Ragnar's response had been swift and absolute. Within a week, every conspirator was dead, along with their families, their servants, anyone who might carry the seeds of rebellion. Within a month, the entire kingdom understood that Ragnar Ironjaw was not a king who ruled through love or law or divine right. He ruled through terror, through the absolute certainty that defiance meant death, and death came with teeth. Now, at 40 years old, Ragnar sat on a throne carved from black oak and decorated with wolf skulls, presiding over a kingdom that obeyed him out of fear and loathed him in their hearts. He was a massive man, standing nearly 7 feet tall, with shoulders like a smith's anvil and hands that had strangled men to death. His hair was dark and wild, never properly cut, always escaping whatever restraints his servants attempted. His face was all hard angles and sharp edges, with a jaw that looked carved from granite and a mouth that had forgotten how to smile. But it was his eyes that truly marked him as other pale amber, wolf's eyes, eyes that saw the world in hierarchies of dominance and submission. He kept wolves in the castle, 6 of them, massive northern timber wolves that prowled the corridors and slept in his chambers and followed him like shadows. The largest was Grimfang, a black male the size of a pony, with yellow eyes that gleamed with intelligence that was almost human. The nobles hated the wolves almost as much as they hated Ragnar himself, but they learned quickly to hide their fear, to step aside when the pack passed, to pretend that having predators wandering the castle was perfectly normal. The castle itself reflected Ragnar's nature, cold, brutal, functional. Where his predecessor had filled the halls with tapestries and art and music, Ragnar had stripped everything away, leaving only stone and iron and darkness. The great hall, where once poets performed and ladies danced, now hosted war councils and weapon training. The gardens where flowers once grew were now training yards where soldiers learned to kill. Beauty had no place in Thornhaven, not anymore. There was only strength, only survival, only the eternal struggle between predator and prey. On a morning in late autumn, with frost painting the windows and the first snow beginning to fall, Ragnar sat in his throne room, listening to his master of coin explain why the kingdom's treasury was empty, and his patience evaporating like breath in cold air. The master of coin, a nervous man named Theron, with ink-stained fingers and a voice like a mouse, was explaining something about tax revenues and trade disruptions and agricultural yields. But Ragnar had stopped listening several minutes ago. Numbers bored him. Excuses bored him. The only thing he cared about was whether he had enough gold to pay his soldiers and feed his wolves. Enough, he growled, the single word echoing through the vast chamber. Grimfang, who had been lying at the base of the throne, raised his head and fixed Theron with a stare that made the man's knees buckle. I don't care about your numbers. I care about results. Find more gold or find yourself someone who can, my lord. Etha provinces are already taxed to their limit. The people are struggling, then let them struggle harder. Ragnar stood, his massive frame unfolding like a storm cloud taking shape. The weak always struggle. That's their purpose. To provide for the strong. He descended from the throne, his boots ringing on stone, the wolf pack falling into formation around him. As he passed Theron, he paused, looked down at the trembling man, and spoke in a voice that was almost gentle, which somehow made it more terrifying. You have 1 month to increase revenues by 20%. If you fail, I'll find someone more motivated. Do you understand? Theron nodded frantically, and Ragnar swept from the room, his wolves flowing around him like a dark tide, leaving the master of coins standing alone in the vast cold chamber, wondering how he was supposed to squeeze blood from stones. The thing about ruling through fear, Ragnar had learned, was that it required constant reinforcement. Let your grip loosen for even a moment, and the prey would remember they outnumbered you, would remember that teeth and claws could be overcome by superior numbers. So he made a point of being visible, of being unpredictable, of demonstrating regularly that defiance led to consequences that were swift and final. He walked through the castle corridors, and servants pressed themselves against walls, their eyes downcast, their breath held until he passed. He entered the kitchens unannounced, and the staff froze mid-motion, knives suspended over cutting boards, ladles dripping soup back into pots, everyone waiting to see if this was an inspection or an execution. He said nothing, simply observed them for a long moment, then took an apple from a basket and left, and the collective exhale of relief followed him down the hall. This was power. This was what it meant to be alpha. Not love, not loyalty, not any of the soft sentiments that poets wrote about and fools believed in. Just fear, pure, simple, effective fear. What Ragnar did not know, could not have known, was that in the lowest levels of his castle, in the laundry rooms where servants scrubbed the blood and dirt from sheets and clothing, there was a woman who did not fear him, not because she was brave, but because she had already lost everything that mattered. And when you have nothing left to lose, fear becomes irrelevant. Her name was Sira, and she was Omega in every sense that the Wolf-blood clans understood the term. Small, slight, with hair the color of autumn leaves and green eyes that were too large for her thin face. She looked like she might blow away in a strong wind. She was 26 years old but looked younger, her body still carrying the half-starved thinness of someone who had never had quite enough to eat. She had been born in a village at the edge of the kingdom, the daughter of a weaver whose hands had been steadier than his luck. And when plague had swept through her village when she was 14, she had been one of the only survivors. The crown had relocated the survivors to the capital, given them work in the castle, and forgotten about them. Sira had been working in the laundries ever since, spending her days up to her elbows in hot water and lye soap, scrubbing stains from noble clothing, invisible to everyone who mattered. She was good at being invisible. It was a survival skill she had perfected over long years, the art of being so unremarkable that eyes slid past her, that minds forgot her as soon as she was out of sight. But invisibility could not protect her from everything. 2 years ago, she had made the mistake of catching the eye of one of Ragnar's minor nobles, a brutal man named Henrik, who believed his rank gave him certain rights over the lower servants. He had cornered her in a storage room one night, and what happened next would have destroyed someone else. But Sira had survived plague, had survived loss, had survived year after year of being nothing, and she had learned that survival sometimes required teeth of its own. She had taken a laundry iron, still hot from the fires, and struck Henrik across the face with it, leaving a scar that twisted his features into a permanent sneer. Then she had run, expecting execution, expecting to be hunted down and killed for daring to defend herself. But Henrik, ashamed to admit that an Omega servant had marked him, had claimed the injury came from a training accident. And Ragnar, who had more important things to worry about than one noble's vanity, had never learned the truth. Sira had returned to the laundries, had continued her invisible existence, and had carried the knowledge that she was capable of violence when necessary. It was a secret strength, like a knife hidden in a sleeve, and it changed something fundamental in how she saw the world. She was not helpless. She was not weak. She was simply waiting. On the morning that would begin everything. Though neither of them knew it yet, Sarah was in the castle courtyard hanging laundry to dry despite the cold and the threat of snow. The work had to be done regardless of weather, and the brisk wind would freeze the moisture from the sheets, leaving them crisp and clean. Her hands were red and chapped, her arms aching from wringing out the heavy fabric. But she worked with steady efficiency, her mind elsewhere, thinking about nothing in particular. The attack came without warning. One of Ragnar's wolves, not Grimthong, but a younger male named Thong, had gotten into a storage room and torn open a sack of grain that was being saved for winter. The Castellan, a hard man named Garrick, who served Ragnar with fanatic loyalty, discovered the damage and went into a rage. He found Fang still in the storage room, grain dust coating his muzzle, and in a moment of spectacular stupidity fueled by anger, Garrick struck the wolf with his walking stick. The wolf, who answered only to Ragnar and tolerated everyone else purely out of pack discipline, responded the way wolves respond to violence from non-pack members. His teeth fastened on Garrick's arm, and the man's screams brought guards running, and in the chaos someone made the decision to try to pull the wolf off with ropes, which only made Fang more aggressive, and suddenly there was a full pack response as the other wolves came running, and the courtyard exploded into snarling violence. Sarah, frozen against the wall, with wet sheets pressed against her chest, watched in horror as the wolf circled the guards, as teeth flashed and men shouted, as the situation spiraled toward bloodshed. And then she saw Fang break free from the ropes and bolt toward the open castle gate, panicked and aggressive and dangerous. And she saw the guards reaching for crossbows, preparing to shoot the king's wolf, which would mean execution for all of them once Ragnar found out. She didn't think. Thinking would have kept her safe, would have kept her invisible. Instead, she dropped the sheets and ran directly into the path of the fleeing wolf, her arms spread wide, her voice calling out in a tone she had never used before, not commanding, not pleading, but something else, something that vibrated in the back of her throat and came from a place deeper than words. Fang slid to a stop, his claws scrabbling on the stone, his lips peeled back from fangs that could crush her windpipe like parchment. The courtyard went silent. Everyone expected to see her torn apart. Instead, Sarah dropped to her knees and lowered her head, exposing her throat, her posture screaming submission and peace and I am not a threat. It was Omega body language at its purest, the universal signal that every Wolfblood clan member understood instinctively. She held perfectly still, her heart hammering, her breath coming in short gasps, and waited. Fang approached slowly, his aggression fading to confusion. He sniffed her hair, her face, her neck. Then, inexplicably, he sat down beside her and leaned his massive weight against her side, nearly knocking her over. His tail gave a tentative wag. What in the frozen hells? Someone whispered. Ragnar's voice cut through the courtyard like a blade. Everyone stand down now. The king had emerged from the castle, drawn by the commotion, with Grimthang at his side. He took in the scene with a single sweeping glance, the panicked guards, the circling wolves, the overturned grain sacks, Garrick clutching his bleeding arm, and at the center of it all, a tiny Omega woman with a wolf, sitting beside her like a devoted hound. He walked forward slowly, and the wolves immediately calmed, responding to their alpha's presence. Grimthong went to Fang, touching noses with the younger wolf, establishing calm. The other wolves settled into watchful positions, and Ragnar stopped directly in front of Sarah, looking down at her from his massive height, his amber eyes unreadable. Stand up, he said quietly. Sarah stood on shaking legs, keeping her eyes lowered, her hands clenched at her sides. Fang remained pressed against her, refusing to leave her side. What's your name? Sarah, my lord. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. You work in the laundries. It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. Yes, my lord. Look at me. She raised her eyes slowly, and for the first time she looked directly at the Alpha King of Thornhaven. What she saw surprised her. She had expected cruelty, brutality, the blank emptiness of a predator. But what she saw instead was intelligence, calculation, and something else, something she couldn't quite name. A kind of wary interest, like a wolf encountering something it had never seen before and didn't know whether to fight or flee. My wolf likes you, Ragnar said. and there was something almost like confusion in his voice. "My wolves don't like anyone. I didn't mean any disrespect, my lord." He was frightened, and I thought you could stop a frightened wolf with your bare hands and a submissive posture. He tilted his head, studying her the way she had seen him study military maps, looking for weaknesses, for patterns. "That was either very brave or very stupid. I didn't want him to be killed, my lord. I didn't want the guards to be executed for defending themselves." She swallowed hard. "I just wanted everyone to be safe." Something flickered across Ragnar's face there and gone so quickly she almost missed it. Then his expression hardened back into its usual granite impassiveness. "Garrick, you struck my wolf." The Castellan, still clutching his bleeding arm, went pale. "My lord, he destroyed the winter grain stores, and I acted without thinking." You acted without thinking," Ragnar repeated flatly. "You struck a member of my pack because you were angry about grain." He looked at the torn sacks, at the spilled grain being dusted with snow. "Grain can be replaced. Can you, my lord, please? You're relieved of your position. Report to the Master of Arms. You'll serve as a regular guard from now on. Perhaps that will teach you to think before you act." Ragnar turned his attention back to Sira, and Garrick sagged with relieved emotion was better than execution. The wolves need a keeper, someone who can tend them when I'm occupied with affairs of state. You'll take that position." Sira felt the bottom drop out of her stomach. "My lord, I don't know anything about keeping wolves. I was just they like you. That's more important than any training." His tone brooked no argument. "You'll move from the servant quarters to the chambers adjacent to mine. The wolves sleep in my room, and you'll need to be nearby. You'll feed them, groom them, keep them healthy. In return, you'll have better quarters, better food, and you won't have to scrub laundry anymore." He paused. "Is there a problem with this arrangement?" There were 1,000 problems with this arrangement, not least that it would put her in constant proximity to the most dangerous man in the kingdom. But Sira had learned long ago that refusing a king's command was not an option, and besides, something in her heart, something foolish and hopeful and entirely unreasonable, whispered that perhaps this was opportunity disguised as danger. "No problem, my lord." "Thank you." Ragnar nodded sharply, then turned and walked back toward the castle, Grim Fang at his heels. Fang remained pressed against Sira's side, and when she tentatively placed her hand on his head, he made a sound deep in his chest that was almost a purr. The other wolves approached cautiously, sniffing her, assessing this strange new member of their extended pack. By the time she finally moved toward the castle, following in Ragnar's wake, she had 5 wolves escorting her, and the entire courtyard was staring in disbelief. The chambers she was given were adjacent to the king's private quarters, connected by a heavy door that could be bolted from either side. They were smaller than she expected, but infinitely better than the crowded servant dormitory she had been living in. There was an actual bed, soft and raised off the cold floor, with clean blankets and a pillow stuffed with feathers. There was a fireplace, currently cold but stocked with wood. There was a window with real glass that looked out over the castle courtyard. By servant standards, these were quarters fit for minor nobility. A sharp-faced woman named Brynja, who served as the king's steward, showed Sarah where the wolves' food was stored, explained the feeding schedule, demonstrated how to check them for injuries or parasites, and gave her a thick leather apron and heavy gloves for protection. "The king values his wolves more than he values most humans," Brynja said bluntly. "If something happens to one of them due to your negligence, you'll wish you'd died in the courtyard. Understand?" Sira understood perfectly. That first night, as she sat in her new chambers trying to process the day's impossible turn of events, she heard scratching at the connecting door. When she opened it, all 6 wolves filed into her room, circled a few times, and settled down on the floor around her bed. Grimfang positioned himself directly between her and the door, a 4-legged guardian who apparently took his duties seriously. "You're supposed to sleep with the king," she whispered to them, feeling ridiculous for talking to wolves. "He'll be angry if you're not there." But the wolves showed no sign of moving, and eventually Sira climbed into bed, surrounded by warm fur and steady breathing and the strange comfort of being accepted by creatures who accepted no one. She fell asleep wondering what she had gotten herself into, and whether she would survive long enough to find out. The next morning, Ragnar discovered his wolves missing from his chambers, and found them piled in Sira's room like she was the most precious thing in the kingdom. His expression when he appeared in her doorway wearing only sleeping trousers and emanating cold fury, would have terrified anyone else. But Sarah, surrounded by wolves who clearly had no intention of moving, met his amber eyes and said the most dangerous thing she could have said. "They chose to be here, my lord. I can't make them do something they don't want to do. Can you?" It was a challenge, subtle but unmistakable. It acknowledged that even the Alpha King could not completely control every aspect of his pack, that sometimes even wolves had agency, that dominance had its limits. For a long moment, Ragnar simply stared at her, and she was certain she had just signed her own death warrant. Then he laughed, a short, harsh bark of sound that held no humor but something that might have been surprise. "No," he said, "I can't force them. They follow me because they choose to, because I'm Alpha, not because I command it." He studied the pile of wolves, then looked back at Sarah. "You're either very clever or very lucky. I haven't decided which. Maybe both, my lord." Another ominous laugh, then he turned and left, and Sarah realized she was trembling but also smiling, and she didn't know whether to be terrified or exhilarated by the fact that she had just challenged the Alpha King in his own castle and survived. The days that followed established a new pattern. Sarah tended the wolves, fed them, groomed them, checked them for injuries, and slowly learned their individual personalities. Grimfang was the leader, serious and protective, who took his role as alpha of the wolf pack with solemn dignity. Fang was younger, more playful, prone to mischief and testing boundaries. There was Shadowpaw, a gray female who was the fastest of the pack and seemed to think every moment was a race. There was Eastfang, nearly white, who had an old injury that made her right rear leg stiff and required gentle massage to keep mobile. There was Bloodmaw, aptly named for his rust-colored fur, who was the most aggressive and required the most careful handling. And there was Moonsong, the smallest, a female with unusual silver markings, who was the most affectionate and spent most of her time pressed against Sira's side. Through the wolves, Sira came to understand Ragnar in ways that the rest of the kingdom could not. She saw how he greeted each wolf individually every morning, how he knew their moods and quirks, how his harsh features softened fractionally when Moonsong brought him a stolen boot to play tug-of-war. She saw that his relationship with the wolves was not dominance and submission in the brutal sense that he practiced with humans, but something more nuanced, a partnership built on mutual respect and understanding. She also saw how alone he was. The wolves were his only companions, his only source of comfort. He had no friends, no confidants, no one he trusted. He took his meals alone in his chambers, worked alone in his study, trained alone in the practice yard. The nobles feared him, the servants avoided him, the guards respected his strength but not the man. He had built a kingdom on fear, and in doing so, he had isolated himself so completely that the wolves were his only family. Sira, being Omega, being naturally inclined toward caring and nurturing, found this intolerable. Not because she pitied him, pity would have been insulting and dangerous, but because she recognized the hollow emptiness of isolation, had lived with it herself for years. And so, slowly, carefully, she began to weave herself into the fabric of his life, in ways so subtle that he barely noticed. She started leaving food in his study when she knew he was too absorbed in work to remember to eat not elaborate meals that would be obvious, just bread and cheese and fruit that appeared on his desk as if by magic. She made sure there was always hot water for washing in his chambers, that his sleeping furs were clean and fresh, that the fire was properly banked for the night. She greeted him when their paths crossed, not with fear but with simple courtesy, as if he were any other person deserving of basic human respect. And she talked to him, which was perhaps the most dangerous thing of all. It started one evening when she was grooming Icefang, working the stiff muscles of the wolf's injured leg, and Ragnar entered the room to find his wolves. He paused, watching her work, and she felt his presence like a weight but didn't stop, didn't react with fear. "She's been favoring that leg more than usual," Sira said conversationally, as if speaking to the most feared man in the kingdom was perfectly normal. "I think the cold weather makes the old injury ache. I've been massaging it twice daily, and it seems to help. She took a spear in that leg during a battle 3 years ago," Ragnar said, moving closer. "The healers said she'd never run again, but she proved them wrong." "She's strong," Sarah agreed, "but even strong creatures need care sometimes. Being strong doesn't mean being invulnerable." She carefully rotated Icefang's leg, working the joint. "There's no shame in acknowledging pain. in accepting help. There was a long silence. Then Ragnar said, in a tone that was almost defensive, "Weakness invites attack. There's a difference between weakness and vulnerability, my lord." She finished with Ice Fang and moved to check Shadowpaw's paws for injuries. Weakness is the inability to protect oneself. Vulnerability is the willingness to acknowledge limits. One is a liability, the other is honest. She glanced up at him briefly. Even alphas have limits. Alphas who admit limits don't stay alpha very long. Alphas who pretend not to have limits make mistakes that get their pack killed. She said it gently, without accusation, but the words hung in the air like smoke. A good alpha knows when to push forward and when to rest, when to fight and when to seek counsel, when to be a wolf and when to be a king. Ragnar stared at her, and she could feel the weight of his amber eyes, could feel him trying to decide if this was insolence or insight. Then he turned and left without another word, and Sarah exhaled slowly, wondering if she had finally pushed too far. But the next evening, he came to the wolf's room again, and this time he sat down on the floor beside her as she worked, and he helped check Bloodmaw's teeth for signs of infection. They worked in silence, but it was a different kind of silence, not empty, but full of possibility. It became a routine. Every evening, after his official duties were done, Ragnar would join Sarah with the wolves. At first, they barely spoke, just worked side by side tending the pack. But gradually, conversation began to flow. She asked him about the wolves' history, and he told her stories of battles and hunts and the early days when he was building his power base. She told him about the wolves' daily activities, about Fang's latest attempt to steal from the kitchens, about Moonsong's habit of collecting shiny objects like a magpie, and sometimes, carefully, she would offer observations that were really questions in disguise. Grimfang disciplined Bloodmaw today for getting too aggressive with the younger wolves. He didn't hurt him, just pinned him and held him until he submitted. It was enough to correct the behavior without creating resentment. Ragnar would nod, understanding the subtext. Sometimes the threat of force is more effective than force itself, and sometimes, Sarah would add softly, the pack is stronger when discipline comes with understanding rather than just punishment. These conversations were dangerous, walking the knife's edge between advice and insubordination. But Ragnar, isolated for so long, hungry for genuine connection, even if he didn't recognize it as such, began to listen. Not always, not immediately, but slowly, like a wolf learning to trust a new member of the pack. The kingdom began to notice changes in their king, though they couldn't identify the cause. Ragnar's justice, while still harsh, became more measured. He started actually listening to his advisors rather than simply issuing orders. When a group of farmers came to petition about unfair taxation, he heard them out instead of dismissing them, and actually reduced the burden on the agricultural provinces. When one of his soldiers made a mistake during training that would normally result in severe punishment, Ragnar assigned extra duties instead, explaining what had been done wrong and why it mattered. The nobles whispered about it in confused tones. The servants wondered if the king was ill. The guards speculated about everything from witchcraft to divine intervention. None of them suspected that the source of the change was a tiny Omega woman who spent her evenings grooming wolves and speaking softly about pack dynamics and the difference between strength and brutality. But Torben, the captain of the guard, and one of the few people in the castle brave enough to speak honestly to Ragnar, noticed. He watched how the king's expression softened fractionally when he walked past the wolves' chambers and heard Sira's voice singing to them. He saw how Ragnar asked about her welfare, ensured she had proper supplies, defended her when other servants complained about her elevated status. One day, Torben found Ragnar alone in the practice yard, working through sword forms with savage intensity, and decided to risk his life for the sake of his king's sanity. "You care about her," he said bluntly. The wolf keeper Ragnar's blade stopped mid-swing. He turned slowly, his expression thunderous. "What did you say?" "I said you care about the Omega woman, Sarah." Torben held his ground, though his hand instinctively moved toward his own weapon. "And before you take my head off for saying it, you should know that's not a bad thing. It's actually the most human thing I've seen from you in the 17 years you've been king." "I don't," Ragnar's jaw clenched. "She's useful." The wolves respond to her. "That's all right. That's why you've been transforming your entire approach to ruling since she arrived. That's why you actually smile when Moonsong brings you stolen items. That's why you haven't executed anyone in 6 weeks, which is the longest streak since you took the crown. Torben crossed his arms. She's changing you, and you're terrified of it, because you think caring about someone makes you weak. Ragnar's knuckles whitened on his sword hilt. Caring makes you vulnerable. Vulnerable kings die. You know what else dies? Torben stepped closer, lowering his voice. Kings who rule only through fear. Because eventually, the fear fades, the strength fails, and there's nothing left to hold the kingdom together. You need more than teeth and terror, Ragnar. You need people who care whether you live or die for reasons other than self-preservation, and you think this Omega servant is going to teach me how to inspire loyalty, how to make people care. The words were heavy with sarcasm, but underneath was genuine confusion, a question that Ragnar didn't know how to ask. I think she already has, Torben said quietly. The question is whether you're brave enough to let it matter. He walked away before Ragnar could respond, leaving the king alone in the practice yard, sword hanging loose in his hand. Amber eyes staring at nothing as he tried to understand the war raging inside his own chest. That night, instead of joining Sarah with the wolves, Ragnar stayed in his study, staring at maps and reports without seeing them. He told himself he was busy, that affairs of state demanded his attention, that establishing patterns of behavior that could be exploited was dangerous. He told himself that Torben was wrong, that the changes in his ruling style were strategic adaptations, not the influence of a woman whose eyes saw straight through his defenses. He told himself many things, and believed none of them. When Sarah knocked on his study door near midnight, he was surprised servants didn't seek him out, certainly didn't knock on his private chambers. "Enter," he called, his voice rougher than intended. She slipped inside, closing the door carefully behind her, and his wolf instincts immediately registered everything: the way she held herself, the determined set of her shoulders, the fact that she was frightened but doing this anyway. "My lord, I apologize for disturbing you, but Icefang is in distress. Her leg has seized up badly, and I can't ease it. I thought I hoped you might be able to help." Ragnar was on his feet immediately, all other concerns forgotten. He followed her to the wolf's chambers and found Icefang lying on her side, panting with pain, her injured leg extended stiffly. The other wolves had gathered around her, whining with concern, and Grimfang looked at Ragnar with what could only be described as pleading. Ragnar knelt beside Icefang, running his hands gently over her leg, feeling where the muscles had locked into spasm. "Heat," he said tersely. "We need heat and sustained pressure." He looked at Sarah. "Help me." They worked together through the night, applying hot compresses, massaging the locked muscles, speaking softly to the wolf to keep her calm. It was slow, painful work, and several times Icefang snapped at them in her distress, teeth flashing dangerously close. But they persisted, and gradually, slowly, the muscles began to release. Dawn was painting the sky pink when Icefang finally relaxed completely, the pain fading from her eyes. She licked Ragnar's hand in gratitude, then did the same to Sira, before settling down to sleep with her head in Sira's lap. Ragnar sat back, exhausted, his hands cramping from the sustained effort. He looked at Sira, who was gently stroking Icefang's ears, her face soft with relief and compassion. And something inside him, something he had kept locked away since childhood, something he thought he had killed along with his father, cracked open. "You didn't have to come get me," he said quietly. "You could have handled it yourself." "I could have tried," Sarah agreed. "But she's your wolf. She needed you." She met his eyes. "We all need someone sometimes, my lord. Even alphas. Especially alphas." "Stop calling me that." She blinked, confused. "My lord. Stop calling me my lord, or your majesty, or any of it, when it's just us." Just he ran a hand through his tangled hair, frustrated with himself for not knowing how to ask for something as simple as his own name. "Call me Ragnar." Sira's eyes widened slightly, and he could see her understanding what this meant. The significance of asking to be addressed as a person rather than a title. "Ragnar," she said softly, testing the name. "All right, then you should call me Sarah, not Wolfkeeper, or Servant, or Omega. Just Sarah." "Sarah," he repeated, and the name felt strange in his mouth, intimate in a way that titles never were. They sat there in the growing light, with the wolves sleeping around them and the castle beginning to wake, and something unspoken passed between them: an understanding, a recognition, the beginning of something that neither of them had names for yet. From that night forward, everything changed. Ragnar began spending more time in the wolf's chambers, and not just for the animals' sake. He and Sarah would talk for hours about everything and nothing, pack dynamics and kingdom politics, the philosophy of power and the nature of loyalty, memories of childhood, hers lonely but not brutal, his brutal but not lonely in the wolf pack, dreams for the future, hers cautious and simple, his expansive and now questioning. She told him about the village where she was born, about watching the plague take her parents and neighbors, about the hollowing grief of being left alive when everyone you loved had died. She told him about Henrik and the laundry iron, about learning that survival sometimes required violence, about the strength she had found in recognizing her own capacity for self-defense. He told her about his mother, the alpha wolf, about learning to hunt and kill before he learned to speak human words, about the jarring horror of being captured by humans and brought to court. He told her about King Aldous, who had tried to teach him humanity, but had died before the lessons took hold. He told her about the murders that bought his throne, about the certainty that he had to rule through fear, because fear was all he understood. "You understand more than fear," Sarah said one evening as they sat by the fire, Moonsong sprawled across both their laps like a furry bridge. "You understand loyalty. The wolves prove that. You understand protection. You've kept this kingdom safe from external threats, even while terrorizing it from within. You understand strategy, leadership, strength." She paused, then added softly, "You just never learned about love." Ragnar's jaw tightened. "Love is a weakness. It makes you vulnerable to manipulation, to betrayal. Love is a strength," Sarah countered. "It gives you something to fight for beyond yourself. It creates bonds that fear can never forge. Fear makes people obey. Love makes them choose to follow." She looked at him directly. "Which kind of kingdom would you rather have? One that obeys because they're terrified, or one that follows because they believe in you?" "I don't know how to build the second kind." "I know." Her hand, small and calloused from work, covered his larger one where it rested on Moonsong's fur. "But you could learn, if you wanted to." He stared at their joined hands, feeling the warmth of her skin, feeling something in his chest that was both painful and wonderful. "And if I do learn, if I try to change, what if I fail? What if I'm too much wolf and not enough man?" "Then you'll fail," Sarah said simply. "But failing while trying is better than succeeding at being a monster." She squeezed his hand gently. "And you're not a monster, Ragnar. You're a man who was hurt so badly as a child that you armored yourself in brutality to survive. But you survived. You're here, and now you have a choice about what comes next." That night, after Sarah had gone to her own chambers to sleep, Ragnar lay in his bed with Grimfang pressed against his side, and tried to understand the chaos in his own head and heart. He was 40 years old, had ruled for 17 years, had built a kingdom and crushed enemies and survived countless attempts on his life. He was the Alpha King, feared across the realm, obeyed without question, and he was absolutely terrified of a tiny Omega woman who saw through all his defenses and somehow still chose to sit with him by the fire and hold his hand and tell him he could be better. The next morning, he called his council together and announced that he was reforming the taxation system to be more equitable, establishing an advisory committee that would include representatives from the common people, and implementing new protocols that required him to justify any execution before it was carried out. The nobles stared at him as if he had grown a second head, but they didn't dare question him openly. What they did question, in whispered conversations in corridors and private chambers, was what had caused this transformation. Some blamed witchcraft, some suspected illness or possession. A few of the more observant ones began to watch Sarah, to notice how the king's mood improved when she was nearby, how his harsh features softened when she entered a room, and some, resenting the influence of an Omega servant, began to plot. The conspiracy was small but deadly. 3 nobles who believed that Ragnar's reforms weakened the kingdom, who longed for the days when nobles held absolute power over their provinces, who saw Sarah as the source of their problems. They were led by Lord Bastion, a bitter man whose father had been among those executed when Ragnar took the throne, who had spent 17 years waiting for revenge. Their plan was simple: kill Sarah in a way that looked like an accident, break Ragnar's spirit, watch him either descend back into brutality or lose the will to rule, then seize power in the chaos that followed. They hired an assassin, a cold woman named Vex, who specialized in poisons and unfortunate accidents, and set the plan in motion during a feast celebrating the autumn harvest. Sira, who had been invited to the feast at Ragnar's insistence, another unprecedented break with tradition that had scandalized the nobles, was seated at a lower table with the castle servants. She wore a new dress that Ragnar had commissioned for her, simple but well-made, in green wool that complemented her eyes. She felt uncomfortable with the attention, with the eyes of the nobility tracking her movements, but Ragnar had asked her to attend, and she found she could not refuse him. The poison was in her wine, a slow-acting toxin that would make her death look like sudden illness. Vex had chosen well. By the time symptoms appeared, Sira would be back in her chambers, and no one would think to connect it to the feast. But Vex had not accounted for the wolves. Moonsong, who had been sleeping under the table near Sira's feet, suddenly lifted her head and began to growl. The sound was low, dangerous, and it cut through the feast chatter like a blade. Grimfang, from his position near Ragnar's high table, immediately came alert. Within seconds, all 6 wolves were on their feet, hackles raised, focused on Sira's wine cup with laser intensity. Ragnar was moving before his conscious mind caught up, his wolf instincts screaming danger. He reached Sira's table in seconds, grabbed the wine cup from her hand before she could drink, and brought it to his nose. The scent was wrong beneath. The wine was something bitter, something that made his wolf senses recoil. Who served this wine? His voice carried across the suddenly silent feast hall. A young servant boy, no more than 12, stepped forward, trembling. "I did, Your Majesty, but I only took it from the pitcher. I swear I didn't." "Where's the pitcher?" "It was found, and the wine in it was clean," which meant the poison had been added after the cup was poured. In the few seconds between when the servant delivered it and when Sira would have drunk it, someone in the feast hall had poisoned her in plain sight of hundreds of people. Ragnar's amber eyes swept the room, and his expression was something beyond fury. Beyond ragged was the face of an alpha wolf defending his pack, and every person in that hall felt the weight of his primal wrath. Everyone remained seated. "No one leaves this hall. Guards, seal the doors." What followed was brutal and efficient. Ragnar questioned everyone at Sira's table, then everyone who had passed near it. He sniffed the wine cup himself, identifying the specific poison wolfsbane, ironically, a toxin that affected humans but would have driven his wolves away from anyone who had handled it. He looked for traces of the powder on clothing, on hands, on anyone who had been near enough to act, and he found it on Vex, who had been posing as a minor noble's handmaiden. The moment his eyes locked onto her, she knew she was caught. She tried to run, but Grimfang brought her down before she made it 5 steps, teeth fastening on her arm without breaking skin. A warning, a promise, a restraint. Ragnar stood over her, and when he spoke, his voice was perfectly calm, which somehow made it more terrifying. "Who hired you?" Vex, professional that she was, stayed silent. But Ragnar had spent years learning to read predators, and he saw the involuntary flick of her eyes toward Lord Bastion's table. He saw Bastion's face go pale, saw him exchange glances with his co-conspirators. Torben, Ragnar said quietly, "Arrest Lord Bastion and anyone who looks guilty." 3 nobles were dragged from the feast hall, protesting their innocence while their faces proclaimed their guilt. Ragnar had them confined to separate cells, then returned to the feast hall and dismissed everyone, his voice carrying a promise of consequences that made even the innocent hurry to leave. Only when the hall was empty, except for his guards, his wolves, and Sira, did Ragnar allow himself to react. His hands were shaking, actually shaking, as he set down the poisoned wine cup. His breath came in short, sharp gasps, and when Sira approached him, concern written across her face, he pulled her roughly into his arms and held her so tightly she could barely breathe. "You almost died," he said into her hair, his voice raw. "If the wolves hadn't sensed it, if I hadn't been watching, if I had been even seconds slower, you would have drunk it, and you would have died." And he couldn't finish the sentence. Couldn't give voice to the absolute devastation he felt at the thought of losing her. Sira wrapped her arms around him as much as she could, given their size difference, and held him while he shook. "I'm alive," she said softly. "I'm here. The wolves saved me. You saved me. I should have protected you better. I should have anticipated that my enemies would target you." He pulled back enough to look at her face, his amber eyes burning with intensity. "You're in danger because of me. Because because you care about me," Sira finished for him. "And I care about you. That makes me a target, yes. But it also makes me someone worth protecting." someone worth fighting for. She cupped his face in her small hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. I'm not afraid of the danger, Ragnar. I'm only afraid of losing what we're building here. What are we building? The question came out almost desperate. I think, Sira said slowly, we're building love. The kind that's strong enough to survive poison and plots, and all the broken pieces of two people who thought they'd never find this. The kind that makes you want to be better, that makes the future look less lonely, that makes the pack stronger because there's more than just fear holding it together. Ragnar stared at her. This tiny Omega woman who had somehow wormed her way past every defense he had built, who saw him as both wolf and man and didn't flinch from either. I don't know how to love, he said honestly. I don't know if I'm capable of it. You love the wolves, Sarah pointed out. You've been loving them for years. You just didn't call it that because alphas aren't supposed to admit to soft feelings. She smiled slightly. You love me too, I think. You just don't have the words for it yet. And standing there in the empty feast hall, surrounded by his wolves and holding the woman who had changed everything, Ragnar realized she was right. He did love her fiercely, protectively, with every broken piece of his heart and soul. He loved her courage, her gentleness, her stubborn refusal to give up on him, even when he had given her every reason to. He loved the way she sang to the wolves, the way she challenged him when he was wrong, the way she looked at him and saw not a monster but a man worth saving. I love you, he said, testing the words, finding them both terrifying and true. I don't know how to do this, how to be what you deserve, but I love you. Sira's eyes filled with tears, good tears, happy tears, and she pulled his head down to kiss him, soft and sweet and full of promise. Then we'll figure it out together, she whispered against his lips. That's what packs do. The conspirators were tried the next day. Ragnar, still furious, but now trying to apply the principles Sarah had taught him, listened to their testimony, considered their motivations, and delivered justice that was harsh but measured. Lord Bastion, as the ringleader, was exiled from the kingdom with only the clothes on his back and a horse, a life sentence of poverty and shame, but not death. His co-conspirators lost their titles and lands, which were redistributed to the common people who worked them. Vex the assassin was given a choice: permanent exile or service in the castle as a food taster, ensuring that any future poisoning attempts would claim her life first. She chose service, recognizing that Ragnar's justice, while severe, was fairer than most. The kingdom buzzed with speculation about the king's mercy, about the woman who had inspired it, about what this meant for the future of Thornhaven. And Ragnar, who had ruled through fear for 17 years, stood before his council and made an announcement that would have been unthinkable mere months before. I'm taking a queen, he said bluntly. Sarah, who has served as keeper to my wolves, will become queen of Thornhaven. Any objections will be noted and ignored. The nobles wisely kept their objections to themselves. They could see the change in their king, could see that this was not a request but a statement of fact. Some were horrified in Omega as queen violated every tradition. Some were calculating, wondering how to use this to their advantage. And some, the wisest among them, recognized that a king who had learned to balance strength with compassion was a more stable ruler than one who knew only brutality. The wedding was held 3 weeks later, a smaller ceremony than tradition demanded, but perfect in its simplicity. Sira wore green silk, her hair braided with autumn leaves, and she stood beside Ragnar in the castle's great hall while a priest said words that neither of them really heard. What mattered was the moment when Ragnar took her hands in his, when he looked down at her with amber eyes that had finally learned to show warmth, when he said his vows in a voice that carried across the hall. I am wolf and I am man, I am alpha and I am king, and I have learned that true strength lies not in ruling through fear but in protecting what I love. I vow to protect you, to honor you, to build with you a kingdom where strength serves compassion rather than crushing it. I vow to be a better man than the one I was, because you showed me that better was possible. Sira's vows were simpler, but no less powerful. I am Omega, and I am woman. I am small in stature, but not in spirit, and I have learned that love is the strongest force in all the kingdoms of men and wolves. I vow to stand beside you, to challenge you when you're wrong, to support you when you're right, and to help you build a Pekka kingdom where fear gives way to loyalty earned through justice and mercy. When they kissed to seal the vows, the 6 wolves howled, and the sound carried through the castle and out across the kingdom. a promise and a proclamation that something fundamental had changed in Thornhaven. The months that followed were not easy. Change never is, especially when it requires dismantling systems built on brutality and replacing them with something more humane. There were nobles who resisted, who clung to their old privileges. There were commoners who couldn't believe the changes were real, who waited for Ragnar to revert to his old ways. There were assassination attempts, not many, but enough to keep Torben and the guards vigilant. But slowly, steadily, the kingdom transformed. Ragnar, with Sira's guidance and support, implemented reforms that distributed wealth more fairly, that gave voice to the common people, that established justice systems based on consistency rather than whim. He was still harsh when harshness was needed, still capable of violence when violence was necessary, but now those traits served a larger purpose rather than existing for their own sake. And Sira, as queen, became the heart that balanced Ragnar's strength. She established schools for children, including orphans like she had been. She created systems to help villages recover from disasters. She held court once a week, where any citizen could bring her concerns. And she advocated tirelessly for those who had no other voice. The people, who had feared their Alpha King, came to love their Omega Queen. And through her, they began to trust that Ragnar's changes were genuine. One evening, nearly a year after their wedding, Ragnar and Sira stood on the castle battlements, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and gold. The 6 wolves lounged around them, content and well-fed, occasionally making soft sounds of contentment. Below them, the castle courtyard was alive with activity, children playing, merchants trading, soldiers training but also laughing, the sound of a kingdom at peace with itself. "You changed me," Ragnar said quietly, his arm around Sira's shoulders. "I was so certain that strength meant fear, that caring meant weakness, that the only way to survive was to be a predator. You changed yourself," Sira corrected gently. "I just showed you that there were other options. You did the hard work of choosing to be different." He pulled her closer, resting his chin on top of her head. "The nobles still whisper that you've enchanted me, that you're a witch who has spelled their king." Sira laughed softly. "Let them whisper. We know the truth, which is that you were never the monster you pretended to be. You were a wounded wolf who had forgotten that wolves can be gentle with their pack, fierce in protection, but soft in affection. You just needed someone to remind you." She tilted her head back to look at him. "And I needed someone to remind me that being Omega doesn't mean being powerless. That gentleness can change the world, just as surely as strength." Ragnar kissed her forehead, her nose, her lips, soft kisses that would have shocked his younger self with their tenderness. "I love you," he said, the words coming easier now, natural after months of practice. "You taught me how, and you taught me that even the most broken hearts can heal," Sira replied. "That even the darkest wolves can learn to love." As the sun set and the stars began to appear, as the wolves settled down for the night and the kingdom below them lived and breathed and grew, the Alpha King and his Omega Queen stood together on the battlements. And they knew that what they had built, this kingdom of strength, tempered by compassion, of fear transformed into loyalty, of 2 broken people who had found wholeness in each other, would endure. Because they had learned the most important lesson, that teeth and fear could conquer a kingdom, but only love could make it worth ruling. That being Alpha meant protecting your pack, not terrifying it. That being Omega meant having the courage to speak truth to power, to offer gentleness in a brutal world, to insist that there was a better way even when no one believed it. They had learned, together, that the strongest packs were not held together by dominance, but by bonds, freely chosen, by loyalty earned through justice and mercy and love. And in learning this, they had transformed not just themselves, but an entire kingdom, proving that even the most hardened hearts could soften, that even the most brutal rulers could learn humanity, that even the deepest darkness could give way to light. The wolves howled, greeting the rising moon, and their song carried across Thornhaven like a promise. The Alpha had learned to love, the Omega had learned her strength, and together, they had created something beautiful from the ruins of Fire, a kingdom where both wolves and humans could thrive, where strength served compassion, where the pack was strongest when every member was valued, and they lived, not happily ever after in the simple sense of fairy tales, but in the complex, challenging, beautiful way that real love demands, working every day to be better, to build better, to love better, knowing that the work was never finished but always worthwhile, because in the end, That's what love does. It doesn't make everything easy. It doesn't erase all pain. But it makes the struggle worthwhile, the pain bearable, the future bright with possibility. And for an Alpha King who had ruled with teeth and fear, and an Omega Queen who had taught him how to love, that was more than enough. It was everything.